The candles in the Duke's bedchamber burned low, their amber light catching the pale trembling of Isolde Vane's hands as she stood in the center of the room. She was 18 years old. She had been a duchess for exactly 6 hours. Outside, the rain hammered the stone walls of Ravensmoor Castle like it was trying to break through, and somewhere down the corridor, the wedding guests were still laughing, still drinking, still celebrating a union she had not chosen. Her ivory gown felt like chains now, heavy satin, pearl buttons that ran from her wrist to her elbow, a veil that had been pinned so tightly her scalp still ached from it. She kept her chin up because her mother had taught her that much before she died. A vain woman never let the world see her crumble. But her hands would not stop shaking. She had heard the stories. Every girl in the county had heard them. Duke Caspian Dre of Ravensmoor, the Iron Duke, they called him. A man who had ruined 3 men in Parliament and never apologized for any of it. A man whose first betrothed had fled the country rather than marry him. The door opened without a knock. He filled the frame, and Isolde's breath caught in her chest like a stone lodged in a narrow river. Duke Caspian Dre was tall, taller than she remembered from the ceremony, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of iron or flat and unreadable in the low light. He was still in his wedding clothes, a black coat, a cravat slightly loosened at the throat. His jaw was rigid. He did not look at her the way the men at the ceremony had, with that sly, calculated interest that made her feel like livestock at market. He looked at her the way a physician looks at a wound, careful, assessing, almost pained. He crossed to the window and stood with his back to her. The silence stretched between them like a sheet of glass, thin and ready to crack. Isolde counted her heartbeats. 6, 7, 8. Then he spoke. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that had learned a long time ago not to need volume to make people listen. "Sit down, Miss Vane. Or, I suppose, Your Grace." He turned then, and what she saw on his face was not cruelty. It was exhaustion. She sat because her knees were already threatening to give way. She chose the armchair nearest the fire rather than the edge of the bed, and she straightened her spine, folding her hands in her lap the way her governess had drilled into her. If she was going to be afraid, she would be afraid like a duchess. He moved to the desk near the window, not to her, away from her, and opened a drawer. What he removed made her stomach drop. A letter. Not just one. A bundle of them, tied with a black cord, placed on the desk between 2 candles as if it were evidence in a trial. And perhaps it was. He did not touch them. He looked at her instead. "Do you know why your father agreed to this marriage?" he asked. A simple question. A devastating one. Because she did know the answer. She had always known it, even when she had tried to pretend otherwise. Her father owed money he could not repay. Her father was sick. Her father had no son. And she, Isolde, with her dark eyes and her passable education and her mother's stubbornness, had been the only thing left worth offering. She nodded, once. "Good," he said. "Now let me tell you what your father didn't know." He sat then, settling into the chair across from her with the careful deliberateness of a man carrying a wound he hadn't shown anyone. The firelight softened the hard planes of his face just enough for her to notice what the ceremony had not. The faint shadow of sleeplessness beneath his eyes, the way his right hand rested slightly too still on the armrest, like a man who had taught himself not to fidget and occasionally forgot why. He picked up one of the letters from the bundle. He held it out to her. She reached across the space between them and took it. The wax seal on the back was broken, her uncle's seal. Silas Vane. Her stomach turned to ice. She knew her uncle well enough to know that anything bearing his seal was either an opportunity or a trap. This letter, she understood within 3 lines, was both. The handwriting was her uncle's, slanted and tight, the letters pressing hard into the paper. It was addressed to a solicitor named Firth in London. It outlined, in careful and meticulous detail, a plan to have her father's estate declared insolvent, his title disputed, and the Vane family reduced to nothing before the autumn harvest. Her fingers tightened on the paper until it crinkled at the edges. She read it twice. Then she set it down on her knee and looked up at the Duke. He was watching her. Not with satisfaction, not with cruelty, with something closer to the way one watches a person walking a narrow bridge over dark water. Ready to speak if they needed steadying. Careful not to startle. "My uncle," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "He was going to take everything." "Within 4 months, if the marriage had not happened," Caspian said. "Your father signed an agreement 2 years ago, one your uncle drafted, that gave Silas controlling interest of the Vane estate should your father default on a debt. The debt, I have reason to believe, was engineered, manufactured through a chain of false creditors your uncle controlled." He paused. "Your father had no idea. He still doesn't." Isolde felt the floor tilt beneath her. She pressed her heel hard into the carpet to steady herself. She thought of her father as she had left him this morning, standing in the rain outside the chapel door, his coat too thin for the weather, his face carrying that particular variety of grief that belongs to men who know they have failed their children. "Why didn't you tell him?" she asked. The question came out sharper than she intended. Caspian did not flinch. "Because telling your father would have required him to act, and in his current state of health, the shock might have killed him. And because any legal challenge would have taken 6 months, time your uncle would have used to finish what he had started." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for the first time she saw something crack, just slightly, in that iron exterior. The fastest way to block your uncle's claim was to make it irrelevant. If the Vane estate is united to Ravensmoor through marriage, your uncle's engineered debt becomes worthless. He loses everything he planned for. And your father, he stopped. He pressed his thumb against his jaw for a moment. Your father keeps his name, his house, his dignity. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the rain had softened to a hiss against the glass. Isolde stared at the man she had married, this cold, feared, iron-jawed stranger, and felt something shift in her chest. Not warmth. Not yet. Something more careful than warmth. Something more like the moment a key turns in a lock you thought had rusted shut. "You could have explained," she said quietly. "You could have come to me before the wedding. Told me the truth. Let me choose." He held her gaze. And this was the moment she would remember for the rest of her life. Not the ceremony, not the vows, not the carriage ride through the gray countryside. This moment. Because he didn't look away, and he didn't offer her an excuse, and he didn't dress the truth in comfort. "Yes," he said, "I could have. And I didn't because I wasn't certain I could trust you. I wasn't certain your uncle hadn't reached you first." He let that sit. "I was wrong not to. I see that now." She studied his face for a long time. There was no apology in his expression, not yet, but there was honesty, the uncomfortable, stripped-bare kind that costs something to give. She looked down at the letter in her lap, at her uncle's handwriting, at the plan that had been laid for her family like a trap in the grass. And she made a decision, not of forgiveness, not of surrender, but of strategy. She was a vain woman. And vain women, her mother had always said, do not run from difficult ground. They learn to walk it. She folded the letter, tucked it into the pocket of her gown, and met his eyes. "Then let's talk," she said. "All of it. From the beginning." 3 years before the wedding, before the Iron Duke and the rain and the terrible letter, Isolde Vane had been a girl who read too much and argued too often and was, by almost every measure her father's peers applied, inconveniently bold for someone in her position. She grew up in Farrow Hall, a country house in the Derbyshire hills that was beautiful in the way old things often are, gracefully, structurally, without the money to fix the bits that time had quietly broken. The east wing leaked in March. The library had more books than the estate had tenants. The formal gardens hadn't been formal since her grandmother's time, and Isolde had spent her entire childhood preferring them that way, overgrown and honest and full of the kind of hiding places that suited a girl who needed to think. Her mother, Lady Constance Vane, had died when Isolde was 11, of a fever the local physician had underestimated and the London specialist had arrived too late to treat. She left behind a daughter with her own dark eyes, her own particular brand of quiet ferocity, and a small leather journal full of observations about the world that made Isolde, on hard days, feel less alone. Her father, Earl Edwin Vane, was a gentleman in the way that certain men are gentle, not weak, but constitutionally disinclined toward combat. He preferred the company of his books and his dogs to the maneuvering of London's political circles, and he had navigated his financial difficulties with the same approach he brought to most uncomfortable things, hoping, very sincerely, that they would resolve themselves. They did not. By the time Isolde turned 15, it was clear to anyone who examined the estate accounts, which Isolde had begun doing herself, because no one else was, that Farrow Hall was in serious trouble. The tenant rents had been declining for years. 2 farms had gone fallow after the flood of 1847. The mortgage her grandfather had taken against the East Wing was compounding with the patient indifference of arithmetic. And her uncle Silas had begun appearing more frequently. He came for Sunday dinners and lingered for weeks. He sat across the table from her father with that particular attentiveness of a man waiting for something. Isolde had watched him, the way she watched everything, from the edges, carefully, saying little. She had decided by the time she was 16 that she did not trust Silas Vane, and she had never once revised that opinion. Uncle Silas was her father's younger brother, handsome in a way that required maintenance, charming in a way that required an audience. He wore London clothes to Derbyshire dinners and spoke of connections in Parliament with the confidence of a man who relied heavily on the word connections, meaning different things to different people. He had married well and badly, a woman of good family and fragile health who had died childless after 3 years of marriage and left him her dowry and nothing else. He had no estate of his own, no title, and, Isolde suspected, no genuine affection for anyone in the world except the particular version of himself he was trying to build. He called Isolde, "my dear," and asked after her pianoforte and never once, in 6 years of Sunday dinners, asked her a question she could answer honestly. She had tried, at 17, after her father had signed some papers Silas had presented, she had asked to read them. Silas had laughed with exactly the right warmth and said the legal language would bore her. Her father had looked grateful for the intervention. Isolde had gone to the library afterward and stayed there until the anger cooled enough to handle. She was not bored by legal language. She was, in fact, uncommonly good at understanding it. She had read law not because anyone suggested it, but because no one had suggested anything else useful. The governess her father had managed to retain for 3 years, a practical Scotswoman named Miss Greer, had treated Isolde with the refreshing assumption that an intelligent girl ought to become an intelligent woman, and had supplemented the usual accomplishments with mathematics, estate management, and 2 years of Latin. Miss Greer had also said, over tea, that the most dangerous position a woman could occupy was ignorance about her own circumstances, and that she should do everything in her power to avoid it. Isolde had taken this to heart with the intensity that characterized everything she did quietly. By 17, she could read a balance sheet. By 17 and a half, she had taught herself the basics of contract law from 3 books wedged behind the philosophy section of her father's library. By 18, 6 weeks before the Duke's proposal arrived, she had found, buried in her father's desk drawer, a document she recognized immediately. The agreement her uncle had drafted. The one with the false debt. The one that would transfer control of Farrow Hall and everything attached to it to Silas Vane, cleanly and legally, the moment her father missed a single quarterly payment. She read it 3 times. Then she put it back exactly where she had found it. And she began to think very carefully about what to do. The proposal from Duke Caspian Dre arrived on a Wednesday, which Isolde would later think of as the most ordinary day that had ever changed everything. It came through the solicitor, a formal written offer, brief, correct, and utterly bloodless. The Duke of Ravensmore requested the honor of Miss Isolde Vane's hand in marriage, contingent upon the agreement of the Earl of Farrow, with a settlement offer attached that would, in a single transaction, eliminate every debt attached to the Vane estate and restore Farrow Hall to solvency. The numbers were precise. They were also, Isolde calculated in the margin of the letter with the stub of pencil she kept in her apron pocket, exactly the amount needed to render her uncle's manufactured debt claim worthless. She sat with that pencil and those numbers for a long time. Long enough for the fire to burn low and the room to go cold. The offer had come the same week her father had missed, for the first time, a quarterly payment. The timing was not coincidental. She knew that. What she didn't know yet What she wouldn't know until the wedding night was who, exactly, had been watching closely enough to send this offer at precisely the right moment. But what? Her father had wept, just a little, when he told her about the proposal. He sat in his study with the letter on the desk between them and kept his eyes on the window, away from her face, the way he always did when the truth of their situation became unavoidable. It would secure everything, he said. The hall. The tenancies. Your sister's futures. He didn't say, I am sorry. He didn't say, I know what I am asking. He didn't say, you are 18 and you deserve to choose. He didn't say any of those things, and Isolde had sat across from him, her hands folded, her spine straight, her mother's stubbornness behind her eyes, and understood that he couldn't. Not because he didn't feel them, but because feeling them and saying them would require him to look at her, and looking at her would show him what he had done, and he had spent his life being too gentle for that kind of reckoning. She had said yes. Not for him. Not exactly. She said yes because she had calculated the alternative and found it worse. And because somewhere in the back of her mind, in the part that had read law books by firelight and memorized the clauses of her uncle's trap, she had thought, if I am going inside the lion's den, I want to go in on my own terms. The morning of the wedding, she had risen before the maids came to dress her. She went to the window of her childhood bedroom, the one that looked east, toward the hills where she used to walk after her mother died, and watched the sun come up over the moor. The light was thin and silver, not warm, the kind of light that illuminates without comforting. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and made herself a private promise. Whatever this marriage was, she would not disappear into it. She would not become the silent, decorative wife that the Duke of Ravensmore had no doubt assumed he was acquiring. She would learn everything there was to learn about this man. She would protect her father. She would find her uncle's weakness. And she would survive. She hadn't known, standing at that window with her hand on the cold glass, that the man she was riding toward had spent the previous night at his own desk reading everything he could find about her. Hadn't known that he, too, was afraid, not of her, but of what he had built around himself in the years since he had last trusted anyone. Hadn't known that the marriage she was bracing against might be the very thing that finally broke them both open. Caspian Dre had not always been the Iron Duke. There had been a version of him, younger, less armored, who had laughed easily and argued politics at Oxford with genuine passion and ridden his horse across the Ravensmore hills in the early morning just because the air was cold and the world was quiet and it felt, briefly, like a life worth being in. That version of him had died, not all at once, but in stages, the way a fire dies, from the edges inward, until what remains is just a core of coal that burns without warmth or light, only heat. The event that started it, that most people in society whispered about and none of them knew correctly, was not a betrayal. Not exactly. It was something worse. It was proof that he had been wrong in the way that matters most, about his own judgment. At 26, Caspian had been engaged to Lady Mirabelle Ashton, the younger daughter of an earl with a grand house in Wiltshire and a reputation for elegance that filled every room she entered. He had loved her in the way young men love, entirely, uncritically, without the seasoning of experience that teaches you that people are capable of holding two contradictory truths at the same time. What Mirabelle had been capable of was something Caspian had taken 18 months to fully understand. She was warm toward him and cold to his staff. She was generous in company and calculating in private. She smiled at him with the particular radiance of a woman who has identified exactly which expression produces the desired result, and she had deployed it with such consistency that he had, for nearly 2 years, believed it to be genuine. The thing that finally shattered the illusion was not dramatic. It was not a single revelation. It was a letter he had not been meant to read, found in his own study, where she had left it in haste when called away to dinner, addressed to a man named Pemberton in London. It outlined, in Mirabelle's elegant handwriting, the precise details of a financial scheme she and Pemberton had been running. They had used Caspian's name, his connections, his credibility. 3 investors had lost substantial money on projects that existed only as paper promises. And Mirabelle's portion, already transferred to a private account in her name, amounted to the equivalent of 2 years of Ravensmore's income. He ended the engagement before dawn the following morning. He repaid the investors from his own estate. And he never, not once in the 8 years since, allowed himself to trust without evidence. That was the wound. That was the thing that had made him iron. Not the loss of Mirabelle herself. He had grieved that quickly, as one grieves the loss of something you realize was never quite real, but the loss of trust in his own perception. He had looked at her every day for 2 years and seen only what she wanted him to see. If he could be that wrong about someone that close, then he could be wrong about anyone. The logical conclusion, arrived at in the cold months after the engagement ended, in the long, empty evenings at Ravensmoor with nothing but account books and candlelight for company, was that proximity was the risk. That the safer course was distance. Correct, dutiful distance. A man who kept people at arm's length could not be manipulated by them. A man who treated every relationship as a transaction could not be devastated when it proved to be one. He had run Ravensmoor on that principle for 8 years. He had been, by most measures, extraordinarily successful. The estate was solvent, his investments profitable, his political influence substantial. He had also been, by most measures his old Oxford friends occasionally remarked upon when they visited and found the house so very quiet, extraordinarily alone. It was his intelligence officer, a careful, quiet man named Marsh who had served Ravensmoor for a decade, who had first brought him information about Silas Vane. Not because Caspian had asked for it, but because Marsh had learned, over the years, the particular kind of information his employer found worth knowing. The Vane situation had come to Marsh's attention through the London solicitor network, where rumors moved like water through stone, slowly and inevitably. Silas Vane was planning something. The details were thin at first: a manufactured debt, a friendly solicitor, a timeline that depended on the Earl's continued decline. Then Marsh discovered the connection between Silas and Pemberton, the same Pemberton from 8 years ago, now operating under a different name, same methods. That was when Caspian began to pay very close attention. He read everything Marsh brought him. He sat with the information for 3 weeks, turning it over, testing its edges. And he arrived at a conclusion that surprised him with its clarity. The girl, the Earl's daughter, 18, educated beyond what her circumstances should have allowed, quiet in company in a way that suggested observation rather than shyness, was in danger. And he was in a position to do something about it. What he had not expected, when he began reading everything Marsh could find about Isolde Vane, was that he would find her interesting. He had expected a well-bred girl shaped by limited options. He had expected correct behavior, pretty accomplishments, the careful blankness of someone who had been taught to aspire to nothing too inconvenient. Instead, Marsh's contacts in Derbyshire had painted a different picture. A girl who managed her father's correspondence when he was unwell, who had renegotiated a tenant lease without being asked to, who had been found more than once in the estate library reading books that were not in any conventional curriculum for young women. One of her former tutors, contacted by Marsh through careful inquiry, had described her as ferociously precise, occasionally impatient, and entirely wasted on the piano. Caspian had read that line twice. He also read the brief note Marsh had included almost as an afterthought, that Miss Vane had, 6 weeks prior, found a document in her father's desk, one of Silas's documents, and replaced it without alerting anyone. Without panicking. She had found the trap and walked away without springing it, which meant she was thinking. Which meant she was already planning something of her own. The proposal had been, on his part, both strategic and, though he would not have admitted it then, something else. Something quieter, more difficult to name. He told himself it was efficient. The marriage would block the debt claim, protect the Earl, and give Caspian a wife who was, by all available evidence, not a fool. He told himself he had approached the situation with his usual precision. He told himself, the night before the wedding, as he sat at his desk and read for the 4th time the list of Isolde Vane's reported qualities, that this was a transaction like any other. He told himself this convincingly enough that he nearly believed it. Nearly. But there was a detail that kept returning to him that Marsh had included without comment, that on the evening she had found her uncle's document, the servants had seen a single light burning in the East Wing library past midnight. And Caspian, who had also sat in empty rooms past midnight with nothing but evidence of other people's cruelty and a fire burning down to ash, had recognized that particular solitude with a precision that unsettled him. He closed the file. He went to bed. He did not sleep particularly well. On the morning of the wedding, Caspian had stood in the vestry of the Ravensmore Chapel in his black coat and watched through the narrow window as the carriages arrived. He watched Isolde step down from the Vane carriage, careful, deliberate, her hand on the footman's arm for exactly as long as necessary and no longer. She was wearing ivory, which suited her coloring, and she was looking at the chapel with an expression he recognized immediately because he had worn it himself, the expression of someone who has made a difficult decision and is carrying it steadily. Not happy. Not broken. Resolved. He felt something then, an unexpected tightening in his chest, something that his body identified before his mind could name it. He looked away from the window. He straightened his cuffs. He told himself, with the authority of a man who had been telling himself difficult things for 8 years, that this was manageable. That she was one more variable in a controlled situation. That he would explain the plan, she would agree to its terms, and they would proceed as rational adults who understood the arrangement. He believed this with some success until approximately the moment she walked through the chapel door. And then he simply looked at her. And the word arrangement became, quietly and permanently, insufficient. The week after the wedding, Ravensmore was a house holding its breath. The great stone pile, 7 generations of drays, 60 rooms, grounds that rolled away to the north until they became moorland and then became sky, had never housed a duchess in residence before, not in living memory. The last Duchess of Ravensmore had been Caspian's mother, who had died when he was 14, and the house had been, in the 12 years since, exactly what Caspian preferred: organized, efficient, and empty of the particular noise that human beings make when they feel at home somewhere. Now there was Isolde. She did not make noise, exactly. But she made presence, the sense of a consciousness moving through a space, noticing things, filing observations away. She had toured the house on her second morning with his housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, at her side. Caspian had watched from the upper gallery railing, not spying precisely. The gallery overlooked the main hall, and he had been there when they came through, and observed the way she moved. Slow in the rooms she found interesting, quick in the ones she had already assessed. Pausing in the doorway of his mother's old study with an expression that was, briefly, unguarded. She did not ask him questions about himself. This surprised him, though he couldn't have articulated why. The women he had encountered in his adult life, the few he had allowed into any proximity, had all, in one way or another, asked questions that were really negotiations. What do you need from me? What version of you can I expect? How much of your favor is available, and at what cost? Isolde asked him nothing. At dinner on the third night, she told him, not asked, told, with a careful exactness that he found unexpectedly interesting, that she intended to review the household accounts when she had a moment, if Mrs. Calloway had no objection. He said, Calloway will have no objection. She nodded and returned to her soup. On the 5th day, she found, in the east corridor behind a tapestry that had not been moved in years, a door that Caspian had forgotten about. It led to a small room that had been used, in his grandmother's time, as a counting room for estate records. The records were still there, dusty, stacked, spanning 6 decades. He found her an hour later sitting cross-legged on the floor in a dress that cost more than a farm laborer's annual wage, reading an estate ledger from 1821 with a pencil stub behind her ear. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up without embarrassment, which was the first of several things about her he would eventually stop trying to predict. Your grandfather owed money to a tile manufacturer in Staffordshire, she said, by way of greeting. He never paid it. That was 60 years ago, Caspian said. The debt would have expired. It has. But the tile company is still running, under a different name. She held up the ledger so he could see the entry. The same family. The current owner's grandfather did the original work. She tapped the entry with her pencil. I thought you might want to know. In case the relationship is worth repairing. He had looked at her for a long moment. The dust in the air. The ledger in her hands. The complete absence of performance in her expression. No bid for his approval, no fear of his reaction, just the straightforward offering of information because she thought it might be useful. "Why?" he asked, and the question came out slightly more raw than he intended. She tilted her head. "Because a duke who honors his grandfather's forgotten debts is a duke the county will remember," she said simply. "And because it's the right thing to do." He had not expected her to say that. Not the first part, the strategic reasoning, yes, he had learned to expect her to think that way. But the second part, the simplicity of it, because it's the right thing to do. He stood there in the doorway of a forgotten room with the dust settling around her and something happening inside his chest that he recognized distantly and had trained himself not to act on. He withdrew. He told himself, firmly, on his way back down the corridor, that he should not read anything into a woman who was simply being competent. Competence was not intimacy. Doing the right thing was not trustworthiness. He had learned, at considerable personal cost, the difference between behavior and character, and 1 week was not enough time to know which one he was looking at. He was still watching. He had told himself that from the beginning, he would watch, and he would wait, and he would not decide anything until he had enough evidence to be certain. That was the rational approach. He had told himself this several times by the time he reached his study. He found, when he sat down at his desk, that he could not remember what he had been intending to do there. It was Isolde's maid, Petra, who first provided him with information he hadn't sought. Petra was a small, observant girl from the Pharaoh Hall estate who had come with Isolde to Ravensmer, the one connection to home Isolde had asked for and received without argument. She brought Isolde's morning tea and helped with her dressing and moved through the great house with the specific invisibility that well-trained servants cultivate. She also had sharp eyes and a memory like a steel trap. Not because she reported to him, she didn't and he hadn't asked her to, but because he had overheard, on his way past the housekeeper's sitting room one evening, a conversation not intended for him. Petra was describing, in the frank, unembellished way of someone talking to a person she trusted, what had happened on the morning of Isolde's departure from Pharaoh Hall. How Isolde had risen at 5 before the maids. How she had gone to her father's study, alone, and spent an hour there. How she had come out with a face that was entirely calm and eyes that were red at the edges, and how she had never, for the rest of that day, let the calmness crack even once. He had stood in the corridor outside the housekeeper's sitting room for longer than was comfortable, listening to something he hadn't known he needed to hear. This girl had sat in her father's study at 5 in the morning on her wedding day and cried, quietly, privately, alone, and then walked out and carried the day without a single visible crack. Not because she was unfeeling. Exactly because she was feeling everything and had decided that none of it was anyone else's business. He understood that. He understood it with a directness that startled him, as if someone had held up a mirror in an unexpected light. He moved away from the corridor. He went to the library, poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey he didn't drink, and sat in the chair by the window until the fire burned low. He thought about Mirabelle, who had cried in front of him frequently and strategically, and who had never, not once, actually needed him. He thought about the morning of his own engagement, how he had stood in his study afterward looking at the ring he had bought and trying to remember when it had started feeling like obligation rather than desire. Then he put all of it away. He was still watching. He needed more time. He needed to be certain. But certainty, Caspian was beginning to suspect, was a thing that existed only in mathematics and law, not in the particular ache of watching someone eat breakfast alone and wondering, against all reason, what she was thinking. Not in the involuntary precision with which he noted, on the 9th morning, that she had moved the chair in the east sitting room 3 inches to the left to catch more of the morning light, without asking, without comment, as if she was quietly making a home of a place she had been handed with no choice in the matter. He had left the chair where she put it. The housekeeper glanced at him, uncertain whether to correct it. He said nothing. The chair stayed. He told himself, walking back to his study, that this was simply good household management. Allowing his wife to feel comfortable in her environment was a reasonable concession that cost him nothing. He told himself this. But he stood at his study window for a long moment, looking out at the moorland to the north, where the heather was beginning to turn and the sky was the particular sharp blue of autumn beginning. and something in his chest that he had kept very carefully silent for 8 years said, quietly, that he was running out of reasons. 3 weeks into the marriage, Isolde found the second letter. It arrived on a Thursday, tucked inside a packet of correspondence addressed to the estate office, mislabeled, she suspected deliberately, in a hand she recognized before she had even fully unfolded the paper. Uncle Silas. He was writing to Caspian. Or rather, writing as if the marriage had never happened, as if Silas was still operating on his original timeline, still expecting the Vane estate to fold by autumn. The letter was cordial on its surface, the kind of prose that required translation. Congratulations on the marriage, of course, and how fortuitous for the Vane family, and might the Duke be interested in a small investment opportunity, purely between family now, of course, and no need to involve solicitors. Below the pleasantries, between lines she had to read with her lawyer's eye, was the actual message. Silas knew his original plan had been blocked. And he was adjusting. The investment scheme outlined in the bottom third of the letter was, to Isolde's trained eye, the outline of a new trap, this one aimed not at her father but at Ravensmoor itself. At Caspian. And it was cleverly built, dressed in the language of opportunity and family goodwill and all the words that people use when they want you to stop looking closely. She took the letter to Caspian that same afternoon. She didn't announce herself with a maid or send a note requesting an appointment. She walked to his study, knocked once, and entered before he had finished saying, "Come in." He was at his desk, sleeves rolled to the elbows, ink on his left hand, working, genuinely working, not performing productivity in the way she had seen her uncle perform it. He looked up. His expression shifted through several things in quick succession: surprise, then something harder to name, then a return to neutral, so rapidly that she would have missed it if she hadn't been watching. She put the letter on the desk in front of him without preamble. "From my uncle," she said. It arrived in the estate office correspondence. I don't believe the mislabeling was accidental. He looked at the letter, then at her. Then he picked it up and read it. She watched his face as he read. The stillness of it, the quality of concentration that was not absence but compression, all of it drawn inward. He set it down. He was quiet for a moment. "This wasn't in the packet I received," he said. "No," she agreed. "Which means someone in this house redirected it. Someone who knew what it contained." The silence between them was different from the silences of the first 2 weeks. Those had been careful, two strangers maintaining safe distances in the same space. This one was something else, shared and charged, two people arriving at the same cliff edge from different directions and finding each other there. "How long did it take you to identify the scheme?" he asked. 20 minutes, she said. "The first structure is identical to the debt claim he used against my father. He has adapted the language, but the underlying mechanism is the same. A false valuation, a chain of nominee companies, an exit that leaves the investor holding paper and Silas holding cash." She sat down, uninvited, in the chair across from his desk. She did it the way she had learned to do everything at Ravensmoor, without apology, because there was nothing to apologize for. "He is going to approach you as family. He will say the investment is small. He will say it is a favor to him after the disruption of the original plan. He will make you feel that refusing is ungracious." She met his eyes. "And he will be watching to see if you show him your accounts." Caspian studied her for a long, unreadable moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "How do you know all of this?" "Because I have been watching him for 2 years, she said. And she told him. Not everything, not yet, not in that first hour, but the important things. The documents she had found in her father's desk. The years of accounting records she had quietly analyzed. The pattern she had traced through the tenant books that showed, in numbers, the slow draining of the Vane estate in directions that led nowhere except Silas's pockets. She spoke carefully, organizing the evidence the way she had learned to organize everything, chronologically, with specifics, without dramatics. She watched Caspian listen. He did not interrupt. He did not offer reassurances or expressions of shock that were really just requests for her to slow down. He listened the way she had always wanted to be listened to, with full attention and the respect of treating her words as information worth taking seriously. When she finished, he was quiet again. She had learned in 3 weeks that his quiet was not absence. It was processing. "You came into this marriage knowing all of this," he said finally. "Yes. Why didn't you go to the magistrate? Or write to a solicitor in London on your own account?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I am 18, unmarried, and my father was the relevant legal party. No one would have taken me seriously. You, they would take seriously." Something moved in his expression, brief, involuntary, the way an expression moves when a person realizes they have been understood in a way they didn't anticipate. He looked down at the letter. He picked up his pen, set it down, picked it up again. "There is someone in this house," he said slowly, "who redirected this letter, who knew it was coming, knew what it contained, and wanted it to reach you rather than me." He looked up. "Or wanted to see what you would do with it when it did." Isolde felt the back of her neck go cold. She had thought the letter was a mistake, a sloppy delivery. But as Caspian said it aloud, she turned the new shape of it over in her mind and felt the weight of it settle. Someone was watching. Not just her uncle from a distance, through his letters and his schemes. Someone closer. Someone inside Ravensmoor. "Who had access to the estate correspondence before it reached you?" she asked. He named 3 people. Then he stopped. Revised. Named a 4th. And the look on his face, when he named the 4th, told her that this particular name was connected to something older, something that lived in the part of him he had not shown her yet. "Marsh," he said. "My intelligence officer." He said it flatly, but something around his eyes tightened. Marsh had served Ravensmoor for 10 years. Marsh was the one who had brought him the information about Silas Vane in the first place. Marsh was the one who had made the proposal possible. And Marsh, Caspian understood this now, in the way that things become clear all at once when the right piece falls into place, was the same man who had, years ago, before coming to Ravensmoor, worked for a solicitor in London. A solicitor whose practice had included, among other clients, a man named Pemberton. Isolde watched the connections land in his face like stones dropping through water. She said nothing. She understood, from experience, that some understandings need silence around them to be fully absorbed. He stood. He crossed to the window and stood with his back to her, and the afternoon light fell across the rigid line of his shoulders, and she saw in that moment not the Iron Duke but the version underneath, the man who had trusted once, and built iron around the wound, and was now discovering that the iron had not, after all, kept him safe. "I built this," he said quietly. "I brought Marsh here. I trusted his information. I built the entire structure of—" He stopped. "It was still the right decision," she said. Turned. "How?" "Because Marsh brought you real information," she said. "The debt claim was real. My uncle's plan was real. The timeline was accurate. Whatever Marsh's reasons for helping you discover it, whether they were clean or not, the result was that my father's estate was protected." She paused. "But it also means Marsh has been feeding information in both directions. To you and to my uncle. And that means my uncle knows more about Ravensmoor's vulnerabilities than he should." The fire between them crackled. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it moving through the moorland grass, a low and continuous sound like something breathing. Caspian looked at her for a long time. The expression on his face was something she couldn't quite read, not because it was blank, but because it was too full to simplify. She thought it might be the face of a man realizing that he had been alone for a very long time and had gotten so accustomed to it that he had stopped noticing the weight. "What do you suggest?" he asked. And that, those 3 words, offered without performance, without delegation wrapped in condescension, was the moment Isolde understood that the Duke of Ravensmoor had just asked her, genuinely, for her help. She sat a little straighter. "We let my uncle think the letter never arrived," she said. "And then we set a trap of our own." Setting a trap for a man like Silas Vane required patience, precision, and the willingness to appear, very convincingly, to be doing nothing at all. Isolde was good at patience. She had spent her entire childhood being underestimated by people who confused quietness with emptiness, and she had long since learned to use that assumption as a tool. The plan she and Caspian worked out over 3 evenings at his study desk, Both of them bent over documents in the lamplight, the fire low, the house asleep around them, was elegant in the way that the best traps are, simple at its surface, complex in its construction, and dependent on the target's own greed doing most of the work. They would accept Silas's investment proposal. Caspian would write back with cautious enthusiasm, interested, not desperate, exactly the right register to signal a man who is tempted but wants to appear prudent. He would suggest a meeting. He would invite Silas to Ravensmoor as family, with all the warmth that implied. And once Silas was inside this house where he thought he had an informant, where he thought he had access, they would give him exactly enough rope to complete a noose. There was a risk. Isolde knew it and did not pretend otherwise. Marsh was still in the house. They had not confronted him. Confronting him would alert Silas, and alerting Silas would end the trap before it closed. So Marsh was allowed to continue his work, to continue his quiet observations, to continue whatever communication channel existed between him and Silas's network. The information he passed along, however, was no longer entirely accurate. Caspian had begun, with a carefulness that impressed even Isolde, to ensure that what Marsh observed was what they intended him to observe. The accounts Marsh had access to showed a specific, manufactured vulnerability in a land holding to the northwest, an undervalued parcel that didn't actually exist but was documented convincingly enough to fool a man who was looking for weakness rather than truth. Silas would see it. He would calculate its potential. And when he came to Ravensmoor for the meeting, he would come carrying the documents for a scheme that would be, when it reached the magistrate's office, the clearest possible evidence of fraud. Isolde had suggested this particular part of the plan. Caspian had looked at her over the desk with an expression that was, she realized, the closest she had yet seen him come to unguarded admiration. "You have done this before," he said. Not a question. Not quite an accusation. Something more interested than either. "I have thought about it," she said. "For 2 years. Different versions of it. But I never had." She stopped herself. "What?" he pressed. She looked at him directly. "I never had anyone to do it with," she said. The words came out quieter than she intended, and she felt them land between them with more weight than she had meant to give them. She straightened. "The legal exposure your name provides is the part one couldn't manufacture alone. No magistrate would have heard a case built on an 18-year-old girl's account books. They will hear it from the Duke of Ravensmoor." Caspian held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then he looked back down at the document between them and said nothing, which was, she was learning, his version of agreement. They worked for another hour. The fire burned lower. Petra brought them tea at 10 o'clock without being asked, which meant she had appointed herself unofficial keeper of their working sessions, and the domesticity of it, the lamplight, the scratch of pen on paper, was so quietly ordinary that Isolde felt it like a small, specific ache in her chest. Like something healing that she hadn't known was wounded. Caspian wrote the letter to Silas on a Friday. It was, Isolde thought, a masterpiece of studied warmth, every word chosen to appeal to exactly the thing her uncle was most susceptible to, which was being treated as an equal by someone whose opinion he coveted. He mentioned the investment with measured interest. He mentioned the Ravensmoor Northwest holdings casually, as a man might mention something he hasn't quite decided what to do with. He ended with an invitation to visit at the new Duchess's request, adding her as motivation was her suggestion, and a good one, because it would tell Silas 2 things. That she was settled into the marriage, and that Caspian trusted her judgment enough to act on her wishes. Both would reassure him. They sealed the letter together. She pressed the wax and he stamped it with the Ravensmoor seal, and for a moment their hands were very close over the desk, his larger, ink-stained, careful, hers smaller, steady. She became aware of his proximity in a way that was new and slightly disorienting. She moved her hand back to her side of the desk. He cleared his throat. Neither of them mentioned it, but the shape of the moment stayed in the room after they had moved on. Silas's reply arrived within 4 days, which told them everything they needed to know about how eagerly he had been waiting. He would be delighted to visit, of course, so good of dear Caspian, so kind of dear Isolde. He mentioned the investment in oblique terms, the way a man mentions something he doesn't want written down explicitly. He gave a date 2 weeks away. They had 2 weeks. They used them. Caspian quietly arranged for the Ravensmore solicitor, a man of impeccable reputation who had known the Duke's father, to be available during the visit. He contacted Magistrate Hale in the county town without specifying the nature of his concern, only that there might be a matter requiring official attention at short notice. Isolde spent the 2 weeks reviewing every piece of the manufactured evidence until she could describe it forwards and backwards. She also spent the 2 weeks doing something she hadn't fully expected, getting to know her husband. Not through dramatic revelations, those had been the first week's work, but through the accumulation of small, daily truths. The way he took his coffee, the books he reached for when he was tired, the way he stood at the study window in the early morning, before the house woke up, just watching the moorland turn light. On the Tuesday before Silas arrived, she found Caspian in the North Wing Gallery, which she had not yet explored, looking at a portrait. She had followed a sound, footsteps, not quite regular, that had brought her up 2 flights and along a corridor that smelled of old fabric and beeswax. The portrait was of a woman in blue, maybe 30, with dark eyes and the kind of face that suggested capability rather than mere prettiness. Isolde stood beside him and looked at it. "Your mother," she said, because the shape of the jaw was unmistakable. "She died when you were 14. He didn't ask how she knew. "Yes." She studied the portrait for a moment. The woman in it looked out with an expression that Isolde recognized, the particular steadiness of someone who has learned not to need external validation. "She ran Ravensmore," Isolde said. "Not a question. For 6 years after my father became ill," he said, "everyone deferred to the steward in public. She made every decision privately." The pause. "People in the county thought the estate had steadied itself through my father's management. It had steadied through hers." He said it with a quietness that was not grief exactly but something adjacent, a wound that had become a fact. She almost said something then. Something about his mother's portrait and what it told her about him, that he had grown up watching a woman manage power in invisibility, that this had shaped the way he looked at competence, that it might be why he had looked at the file on Isolde Vane with something beyond calculation. She almost said it. She didn't. Some things needed to arrive in their own time. Instead, she looked at the portrait a moment longer and then said, "She would have found my uncle very boring." There was a pause. Then, unexpected, real, brief, Caspian laughed. It was small, the laugh, barely a sound, more air than voice, like something that had been shut in a room for years and briefly got out through a window. But it was genuine, and it changed his face completely. For just a second, the iron fell away, and what was underneath was someone she hadn't yet met but recognized immediately. She filed that laugh away in the back of her mind, in the same place she kept the careful and the important, and she did not let herself examine it too closely. She had a trap to set. She had an uncle to unmask. She had a marriage to survive. And she was, for the first time in her life, not entirely certain she was doing it alone. Silas Vane arrived on a Wednesday afternoon when the sky was the color of pewter and the moors stretched away to the horizon like something that had forgotten warmth. He came in a hired carriage rather than his own, which was either economy or theater. With Silas it was often both. He stepped out onto the Ravensmore Drive in a coat that was too new, leather gloves that were too pale for the journey he had supposedly taken, and a smile that Isolde watched arrive on his face the way an actor steps into light, precisely when needed, not a moment before. She stood on the steps with Caspian beside her, and she felt the practiced composure of her expression hold steady as her uncle's eyes found her. He was good. She had always known he was good. He looked at her with exactly the right mixture of fondness and relief, the face of a man who was simply glad to see his niece settled and well. He kissed her cheek. He called her my dear. He shook Caspian's hand with the warmth of a man who respects another man. And Isolde, who had spent 6 years learning to read the negative space between what her uncle said and what he meant, watched the calculations behind his eyes and said nothing. The first evening was all performance. Dinner in the formal dining room, which Mrs. Calloway had arranged beautifully, candles and crystal and the Ravensmore silver that hadn't been polished since the previous autumn. Silas was charming. He spoke of London, of Parliament, of mutual acquaintances. He asked after Isolde's father with well-manufactured concern. He praised the house in exactly the terms that would have pleased the kind of man who needed his house praised. Caspian received all of it with the measured cordiality of someone who is socially adept and personally uninvested. The iron returned in public, useful as armor. Isolde watched from her end of the table. She ate well and spoke little and let Silas establish his tempo. Let him feel in control of the evening. She saw the moment, over the fish course, when his eyes moved past her to the portrait of the West Ravensmore holdings on the wall behind her. A flicker of assessment, quick and professional, that he shuddered immediately. He had seen the map. He was orienting himself. That was exactly what they needed him to do. After dinner, Caspian invited him to the study, the offer of brandy and discussion that served in this world as both hospitality and invitation to the real conversation. Isolde was not invited. This was intentional. They had agreed she would be absent for this first meeting, because her presence would remind Silas that she was listening, and they needed him to forget that. She retired to the sitting room adjacent to the study with a book she did not read and a cup of tea she did not drink, and sat very still, listening to the muffled rise and fall of conversation through the wall. She could not hear the words. She could hear the rhythm, and she tracked it, noting the moment the conversation moved from pleasantries into the particular steady register of business. That transition took 22 minutes. Caspian was good. He had let Silas lead the way there, which meant Silas would feel he had initiated it. Isolde turned a page she hadn't read. Outside, the wind moved through the moorland, and somewhere deep in the house, a clock chimed 9. She counted the chimes. She breathed. She waited. It was 40 minutes later when Marsh appeared. She knew it was Marsh before she looked up. She had been watching for him, knowing that tonight, with Silas in the house, the information channel would be active. He came down the upstairs corridor and stopped at the sitting room door, surprised to find her there. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Marsh was a compact, careful man with a face that revealed very little, which was, she supposed, why Caspian had trusted him. She looked at him with the same steadiness she brought to everything, the same absence of flinching that had served her since she was 16 years old, and began to understand that the world would not be kind just because she deserved it to be. "Mrs. Calloway needs something from the upstairs linen room," he said. His voice was even. "I am sorry to disturb you, Your Grace." He had nothing in his hands. The linen room was in the east wing, not upstairs. She let the lie sit between them for one quiet beat. "Of course," she said pleasantly. "Don't let me keep you." He withdrew. She counted to 30. Then she rose from the sitting room, moved to the door, and watched him go, not toward the linen room, not toward the east wing, but toward the back staircase that led to the servants' quarters where, she now knew, there was a window with a clear view of the drive. She had expected him to be the conduit. What she had not fully predicted was how fast it would move. The documents appeared the following morning. Silas's documents, brought to the breakfast table inside a leather portfolio that he set beside his plate with the studied casualness of a man who had rehearsed the gesture. He spoke of the investment over eggs and toast with the precision of someone who had arranged his presentation the night before. The numbers were clean. The opportunity was genuine-looking. The Northwest parcel, the manufactured one, the vulnerability they had built into the accounts for him to find, was mentioned as an afterthought, a small thing, barely worth discussing. He looked at Caspian with the expression of a man doing a favor. He glanced at Isolde with the expression of a man who assumes she isn't following the numbers. She followed every one. She sipped her tea. She let Caspian handle the conversation, which he did with immaculate control, interested, asking the right questions, moving the discussion exactly where they needed it to go. By the time the breakfast plates were cleared, Silas had laid out enough of his scheme, on paper and in words, that the solicitor Caspian had quietly installed in the east sitting room could begin the formal documentation of everything said. The moment of the trap's closing was quieter than she had imagined it. She had thought there would be a confrontation, the dramatic moment, the revelation, the crumbling face. Instead, Magistrate Hale arrived at 11:30, accompanied by 2 officers and the solicitor, and the atmosphere in the Ravensmore breakfast room changed the way air changes before a storm. A pressure shift, a stillness, a quality of held breath. Silas recognized it before the introductions were made. She watched it happen across his face, the calculation going wrong, the pieces rearranging themselves, the charm machinery running out of leverage. He looked at Caspian. He looked at Isolde. And she saw, in the precise instant he looked at her, the moment he understood that she had not come to Ravensmore as cargo. She had come as the architect. The composure held in his face for another 10 seconds. It was, she thought, the longest 10 seconds she had ever counted. Then Magistrate Hale spoke. Silas's solicitor, brought in the previous day by Marsh, per the channel they had expected him to use, produced, inadvertently, documentation that completed the fraud case the Ravensmore solicitor had been quietly building. Silas had arrived with the final piece of his own arrest. Marsh was detained an hour later, in the stables. He had been attempting, with a calm that suggested he had always known this was coming, to saddle a horse. He did not resist. He answered the officer's questions with the brevity of a man who has accepted an outcome he had been running from. Caspian did not go to the stables. He remained in the study with the door closed. Isolde left him to it for 20 minutes. She understood the particular quality of that closing, the weight of discovering that someone you trusted had been carrying two faces. She had lived that weight with her uncle for 2 years. After 20 minutes she knocked. He didn't answer immediately. She entered anyway. He was at the window. His window, the one that faced north toward the moorland. His hands were clasped behind his back and his shoulders were rigid, and he had not turned when the door opened. She crossed the room and stood beside him. Not touching. Just beside. The moorland was gray and still, the heather flattened by the morning wind. They stood there for a moment that required no words. Two people who had been alone in different ways, in the same house, looking at the same landscape together for the first time. "It's done," she said quietly. He exhaled. "Yes." Then, after a beat, "Thank you." In the days after Silas's arrest, Ravensmore felt different. Not lighter exactly. The house had too much stone and old silence for anything to change its weight quickly, but different in the way a room feels different when the thing you were pretending not to smell has finally been removed. Cleaner. More honest. The household adjusted without being told to, the way households do when tension resolves. Mrs. Calloway smiled more, the kitchen produced better food, the morning fires were lit with something that felt less like obligation. Isolde noticed all of it and filed it away, because she noticed everything, and because she was still, even now, even with the trap closed and her uncle in custody and the Vane estate's protection secured by letter from the magistrate's office, still not entirely certain what came next. She knew what Ravensmore had been. A transaction, a shield, a carefully negotiated arrangement. What it was becoming, she was less certain of. She sat at breakfast on the 4th morning after Silas's arrest and watched Caspian read his correspondence and thought about the shape of a life she hadn't chosen and was finding, with increasing discomfort, that she minded considerably less than she had expected. She wrote to her father that week. Not the careful, managed letter she had sent the week of the wedding, that one had been all reassurance, all surface comfort. This one was honest. She told him about the debt claim, about Silas's plan, about the marriage's real purpose and what it had achieved. She wrote it slowly over 2 evenings, choosing each word with the care she brought to legal documents, precise, clear, and arranged so that the truth arrived in an order he could absorb without being crushed by it. She did not tell him everything. She did not tell him that she had sat in his study at 5 in the morning on her wedding day and wept. Some truths are for the person who holds them, not for the one who would grieve to know them. She sealed the letter and gave it to the Ravensmore post with a steadiness that surprised her only slightly. Then she sat in the East Wing library for a long time, the one with the window she liked, the one Caspian had quietly had rebuilt into her rooms, and let herself feel the particular mix of grief and relief that is what justice actually feels like, which is nothing like what you imagined it would. Her father's reply came 8 days later. It was short. Her father had never been a long letter writer. He said he was sorry. He said he had known, vaguely, that something was wrong, but had not let himself know it fully because knowing it fully would have required him to act. He said he was grateful, not in the abundant way of men who are unaware of what they are grateful for, but in the specific, raw way of someone who understands exactly the cost of the thing done on their behalf. The last line of the letter read, "Your mother would have known what to say to you. I only know that I am proud." She had to put the letter down for a moment. Petra, who was in the corner of the room pretending to sort ribbons and doing nothing of the sort, said nothing and handed her a handkerchief with the wordless tact of someone who has watched a person carry too much for too long. Isolde held the letter a moment longer. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the small leather journal she kept in her top drawer, the one that had been her mother's, and closed it, and went back to the work of becoming something she hadn't expected to be. It was Caspian who came to her that evening. He knocked, which he hadn't always done in the first weeks, and entered when she answered. He was carrying something, the file. The original file. The one Marsh had built. He set it on the desk between them and remained standing, and she could see in the way he held himself that this was a thing he had decided to do after considerable thought, and that the thought had been uncomfortable. "I want you to read this," he said. "The full record. Everything Marsh gathered. Everything I used to build the case for the marriage." He paused. "And everything I was wrong about." She looked at the file. Then at him. "There is a section," he said carefully, "in the early weeks of Marsh's observation, where I had reason to question your motives. I had evidence, or what presented itself as evidence, that you had contacted Pemberton's network directly." He met her eyes. "You hadn't. The evidence was fabricated by Marsh. I didn't know that then. I know it now." He stood there, this tall, iron-faced man in his own house, and held her gaze with a steadiness that was clearly costing him something, and offered her the file and the truth inside it. "I am not asking you to forgive the suspicion," he said. "I am asking you to know that I no longer hold it." She took the file. She read it that night, alone, by lamplight. It took 3 hours. Some of it was cold and precise. Marsh's intelligence reports, Caspian's marginal notes, the language of a man who processed the world as information to be evaluated. Some of it was harder to read. The section where the fabricated evidence had led Caspian to consider, for a period of 9 days, that she might be a planted agent of his enemies. 9 days of marriage, she calculated, in which he had been in the same house with her, having dinner with her, talking with her at his study desk about the trap they were building, while carrying the quiet suspicion that she might be the trap itself. She thought about those 9 days. She thought about the chair he had left in its new position by the morning light. She thought about the letter to the tile manufacturer in Staffordshire that he had written, she now knew from the file's dates, during those same 9 days. She closed the file at 1 in the morning and sat for a long time in the chair by the dying fire. She thought about what it meant to extend trust when you had every reason not to. She thought about doing the right thing when no one is watching. She thought about a man in an empty house, past midnight, doing both. She found him the next morning in the North Gallery. Not by accident this time, she had gone looking. He was not looking at his mother's portrait. He was at the far end of the gallery in the light from the tall north window, reading. He looked up when she entered, and whatever he saw on her face made him close the book and set it down. She crossed the gallery and stopped in front of him. She was holding the file. "I have read it," she said. He nodded once. "I want to say something, and I need you to hear it without interrupting," she said. He nodded again. "You were wrong about me," she said. "And you knew you were wrong before Marsh's deception was confirmed. I think you knew it during those 9 days, or close to it. I think that is why you kept doing the small things." She held his gaze. "The chair. The window seat in my rooms. The way you listened when I spoke, as if what I said actually mattered. Those are not the actions of a man who believes the worst of someone." He said nothing. The light from the north window caught the line of his jaw, the careful stillness of his eyes. "You were in pain," she said, "and still you chose right. I want you to know that I saw it." The silence that followed was the longest she had yet experienced in his company, and she had experienced several. This one was different. Not empty, full of something that neither of them had the language for yet, but that both of them recognized in the way you recognize a smell from childhood, immediately without needing to name it. He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched something shift in his face, not the small shifts she had been cataloging for weeks, but a larger one, as if something structural had finally decided to move. "I had a woman in my life once," he said, "who gave me every performance of care and none of the substance." He said it quietly, without self-pity, in the tone of a man reporting a fact. "After that, I decided performance and substance looked the same, and I stopped trying to distinguish them." The pause. "You are extremely difficult to misread." She felt something warm move in her chest. Not love yet, not the word, but its architecture, its foundation. "Is that a compliment?" she asked. He looked at her with the expression she had first seen on their wedding night. Not cruelty, not iron, but exhaustion, except this time beneath the exhaustion was something else. Tentative. Alive. "It is a beginning," he said. And outside, through the north window, the moorland shifted from gray to gold as the clouds thinned. 2 months after the wedding, Isolde received a letter that changed everything again. It arrived at dawn, delivered by a rider who had traveled through the night. A Derbyshire rider, coated in mud, with the Farrow Hall seal on the lettercase. She was in the breakfast room when the butler brought it. She recognized the seal before she touched the case and felt the cold arrive in her chest the way cold always does when you know, before you know. The slow, certain drop of a stone through still water. She opened it with steady hands. Her father was ill. Not the usual ill, not the gradual, managed decline of a man whose health had been fragile for years. Acutely ill. Fever. The local physician had been called in the night. The letter was from his secretary, written on instruction. His lordship wishes to see his daughter. Those specific words. Wishes to see. Not would welcome a visit. Wishes to see. She set the letter on the table. She pressed her palms flat against the tablecloth for a moment and breathed. Then she rose, folded the letter into her pocket, and went to find her husband. She did not run. A vain woman never ran. But she moved with the swift, purposeful stride of someone for whom every second from this moment forward would be measured against something she could not stop. Caspian was in the study when she found him, already at his desk. The man kept hours that suggested sleep was something he did as a concession rather than a need. She put the letter on the desk in front of him without preamble. He read it in the same compressive silence he brought to everything important. When he looked up, his expression was not the studied neutrality of a man managing his distance. It was simpler than that. "We will leave within the hour," he said. She had not asked him to come. She had not even considered, in the 30 seconds between the breakfast room and the study, what she would say to him about it. She had simply carried the letter to the one person in her life with whom she had, quietly and without ceremony, begun to build something that felt like a partnership. And he had said we. One word. Simple. So matter-of-fact that she almost missed the weight of it. She stood in the study doorway for a moment after he had returned to his desk, already reaching for the bell pull to summon the carriage arrangements, and felt something move in her chest that she no longer tried to rename. She went to pack. She packed quickly. She did not think about what she would find in Derbyshire, because thinking about it before she arrived would only make the journey longer. They traveled through a day that deteriorated as they went north, the sky lowering, the temperature dropping, the road becoming the kind of rutted and puddled track that belonged to the season turning. The carriage was good, Ravensmore's, not the hired Farrow Hall vehicle, and it rode more smoothly than the journey deserved. Caspian sat across from her. For the first 2 hours they were both quiet, not the uncomfortable quiet of strangers but the shared quiet of people who understand that some silences don't need filling. He had brought a map and was studying the North Road. She had brought her mother's journal and was not reading it, holding it instead in her lap with both hands, the leather worn smooth in the places her mother's hands had worn it smooth before her. It started raining around midday. Large, serious drops that struck the carriage windows and ran down in long, quick lines. She looked at them. "Tell me something about her," he said. She looked up. He was watching her, not at the map anymore, with the particular attentiveness she had come to understand was his version of gentleness. She looked back out at the rain. She used to walk in the rain, she said. She said it was the only time the world was fully honest. The pause. I didn't understand what she meant until I was about 14. She felt him watching her. And then I did, she said quietly. They arrived at Farrow Hall in the early evening. The house looked smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply grown used to Ravensmoor's scale. The windows of the east wing were lit. The sick room, the one that faced the garden, where her father had been moved because the morning light was easier there. The physician met them at the door. Fever, he confirmed, high and persistent, responsive to treatment but slowly. The Earl was weakened, but he was awake, and he had been asking for his daughter since before dawn. She went up alone. She needed to see him alone first. Caspian understood this without being told and remained in the hall below, which she felt rather than saw as she climbed the stairs, the understanding, the deliberate space being created. Her father was smaller in the bed than she remembered. Illness does that. It returns people to something more essential. He was pale and the lines of his face were deep, and his hands, when she took them in hers, were thin and dry. But his eyes when he opened them were the same quiet blue they had always been, the same eyes that had always loved her in the generous, insufficient way of a man who loved genuinely and expressed it imperfectly. Izzy, he said. It was what he had called her when she was small. She hadn't been Izzy in years. She found she didn't mind. He apologized. She had not expected him to, had not thought he had the language for it. But he did. He took her hand and held it with both of his and said, haltingly, in the voice of a man who has been lying awake constructing sentences that matter, I am sorry. For the marriage, for not protecting her, for not being well enough to fight, for letting the situation close around them both like water rising. She listened. She did not interrupt. She let him say everything he needed to say, and she held his hands, and she was as steady for him as she had been for everyone, for her whole life, for every situation that required her to be the one who didn't crack. And then, when he was finished, when he had run out of apologies and was looking at her with the exhausted relief of a man who has finally put down something too heavy, she leaned forward and put her forehead against his hand and let herself, briefly, be not steady at all. Just for a moment. Just for herself. His hand moved to her hair, the way it had when she was 8 and 12 and 15, and every time the world had been too much. And they stayed like that for a little while, father and daughter in the lamplight, while outside the rain said everything neither of them had the words for. She came downstairs an hour later. Caspian was in the sitting room, not pacing, not performing patience, just sitting in the chair nearest the fire with a cup of tea he had been given and probably hadn't drunk, reading something from the small shelf beside the chair with the apparent ease of a man entirely comfortable in someone else's house. He looked up when she came in. She crossed the room and sat in the chair across from him, her mother's chair, the one with the faded roses, and said, "He is going to be all right." Something in Caspian's face released. "Good," he said. Just that. She looked at the fire. "He apologized," she said, "for the marriage." Caspian was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" "I said nothing," she said. "I just let him say it." She turned her head and looked at her husband, this man she had married under duress and difficulty, this man she had discovered incrementally over 2 months of lamplight and ledgers and a shared trap and a single unguarded laugh in a portrait gallery, and she said, very quietly, "I do not regret it." He looked at her. Not with relief, not with triumph. With something quieter than either. Something that looked, from this distance, very much like the beginning of being known. But then came the knock at the door. Isolde heard it from the sitting room. Sharp, urgent, wrong in a way that the knocks of ordinary callers are never wrong. She saw the change in Caspian before she heard the voice. His spine straightened, his hands still, the iron coming back not as defense but as readiness. The door was opened by the Farrow Hall butler. The man outside was breathing hard, his coat wet with rain. He was one of the Ravensmoor estate riders. She recognized the livery. He had ridden ahead of something. She understood immediately. He had ridden to warn them. His message came out in short, urgent pieces. There had been a development in the Silas Vane case. Not a resolution, a rupture. Silas had not been held. The initial charge had been challenged by his solicitor on a procedural defect. A document in the magistrate's filing that bore a timing inconsistency. The challenge had been upheld by a London circuit judge, under pressure from connections none of them had anticipated. Silas had been released 3 hours ago. And before he had left the magistrate's office, he told the officers, calmly, cordially, in the voice of a man who was very angry and very good at not showing it, that he intended to revisit the matter of his niece's marriage. They had 48 hours before Silas reached them. That was the writer's estimate, accounting for his head start and the state of the northern roads after 2 days of rain. 48 hours in a house that was no longer Ravensmoor but Farrow Hall, smaller and lighter and full of the specific vulnerability of a sick man upstairs and a lifetime of memories in the walls. Isolde did not waste a single minute of those 48 hours. She sat at her father's writing desk at 11 o'clock at night with Caspian across the table from her, 2 lamps burning, and they rebuilt the case. Not the trap. The trap was burned now, its documents confiscated or corrupted in the procedural challenge. The new case. The real case. The one that did not require manufactured evidence or intelligence intermediaries or the cooperative confession of a man who had now been warned. This one would have to be built from the ground up, from the original documents. The account books she had read over 2 years, the tenant records from Farrow Hall, the letters she had kept, including the one from her wedding night, the first letter Caspian had shown her, which she had not returned to the bundle but kept, folded, in the leather journal in her traveling bag, because she had understood even then that it might one day matter. She had the letters. She had the account books. She had written to Farrow Hall's secretary weeks ago, quietly, asking for copies of specific years' records on the pretense of familiarizing herself with her father's affairs as the new Duchess. The copies were in a chest in the Farrow Hall library. She went to get them at midnight, alone, carrying a lamp through the dark house, the old corridors she had walked since childhood, the creak of the third stair, the smell of wood smoke and old paper and the particular cold that came in through the east window in November. She brought the chest back to the desk and they opened it together. What she had, laid out on the desk in the lamplight, was 5 years of financial records, cross-referenced against the fabricated debt timeline in Silas's original scheme, that demonstrated, with the slow and irrefutable arithmetic of real numbers, that the debt had been engineered, not alleged. Proven. Because 5 years of accounts don't lie. They accumulate. And accumulated truth is a different thing from a single document challenge. Caspian understood this as quickly as she did. He leaned over the desk with his sleeves rolled up, and they worked. By 3 in the morning they had a document that neither of them could find a flaw in. It was 41 pages, written in Isolde's hand because her writing was clearer, cross-referenced with document numbers from the chest, organized chronologically, and prefaced with a 2-page summary in language plain enough for a justice unfamiliar with estate accounting. Caspian had read the summary twice. He had made 2 revisions. She accepted one and argued the other, and they found a third version neither of them had started with, which was better than either. He had looked at the revised sentence for a moment after she wrote it in and said, "You are a remarkably good lawyer." She had said, "I had good teachers and a very compelling reason to learn." He had looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his honest face, the one that existed in the territory between his public iron and whatever was deepest underneath, the middle ground that belonged only to the two of them, and said nothing, which she knew by now was the way he said the things that mattered most. They were still sitting at the desk when the birds began outside before dawn, and the lamp oil was low, and neither of them had slept. Silas arrived the following evening. He came alone, no solicitor this time, no hired carriage. He came on horseback, which told her he had pushed through the night and the day, which told her he was running on something sharper than strategy. He came to the front door of Farrow Hall and knocked, and when the butler opened it, he looked past the butler and found Isolde. She had been waiting in the hall. She had known, with the specific certainty of someone who has studied a man for 6 years, that he would come here first. Not to Ravensmoor. Because Farrow Hall was where he believed he had leverage. The sick father, the history, the old debt of obligation that families use against each other when other tools fail. He looked at her. She looked at him. For a moment there was nothing between them but the lamplight and the rain-damp air and 6 years of pretending, finally given up. "Isolde," he said, "this has gone far enough." "Yes," she agreed. It has. And she stepped aside. Behind her, in the doorway to her father's study, stood Caspian. And beside Caspian stood someone Silas had not expected, a man in the formal attire of the London Circuit Court, with the kind of face that looked like authority because it was the Honourable Lord Justice Carew, who had travelled from London at Caspian's private request 3 days ago, before Silas's release. Silas's face performed several things in quick succession. Surprise. Recalibration. The attempt at a smile. Caspian, he said, shifting to the warmer register. I think there has been a misunderstanding. There hasn't, Caspian said. Simple. Final. The way he said things when they were done being negotiated. Lord Justice Carew stepped forward. He introduced himself in the precise and quiet tone of a man who has made introductions like this before and knows their weight. He explained that he was here as an officer of the court, called to review materials provided by the Duke of Ravensmore pertaining to an ongoing matter of suspected financial fraud and document fabrication. He indicated the folder under his arm, the 41 pages, the cross-referenced accounts, the accumulated truth that 5 years of arithmetic had built into something no procedural challenge could dismantle. He asked Silas to accompany him to the study. Silas stood in the Pharaoh Hall doorway in his rain-soaked coat and looked at his niece one more time, and what passed across his face in that moment was something she had never seen on him before. Not the charm. Not the calculation. Something underneath all of it, older and smaller. The face of a man realizing that the person he had dismissed as inconsequential was the one who had finished him. She went upstairs while it was happening. She had done her part. The rest belonged to the law, and she had always understood the difference between building a case and needing to watch it close. She went to her father's room, the sick room with the morning light window, and sat in the chair beside his bed and held his hand while he slept. He was improving. The fever had broken that afternoon, and the color in his face was the color of a man coming back to himself rather than leaving. She sat in the quiet and listened to his breathing and to the muffled voices from the study below, the formal, steady register of legal proceedings beginning, and she let herself, for the first time since the rider had arrived in the rain with his news, exhale fully. All the way out. The kind of exhale that releases what you have been carrying so long you forgot it had weight. Petra appeared in the doorway at some point with a shawl. Isolde hadn't noticed the cold, and draped it over her shoulders without a word, which was the kind of friendship that doesn't need language, just presence. She nodded her thanks. She kept her father's hand and stayed. Silas Vane was arrested formally the following morning. The procedural defect in the original charge was overturned by Lord Justice Carew's independent review. It had been manufactured, the court found, through a forged date on a filing document, which added a new charge to an already substantial case. The network of false creditors was traced through the account books she had provided. Pemberton was implicated. 2 additional counts of fraud were added, reaching back 7 years. The Vane estate's debt claim was officially nullified. Pharaoh Hall was free. On the morning after the arrest, Isolde stood at the window of her old bedroom, the east-facing one that looked toward the hills, and watched the sun rise over the moor. The light was different from the morning of her wedding. That morning it had been thin and silver, honest without comfort. This morning it was gold. Actual gold, the kind that comes in autumn when the angle of the sun is just right, laying itself across the hillsides like something generous. She stood with her palm against the glass, not cold this time, warmed by the light, and felt the particular stillness of an ending that is also a beginning. Behind her, someone knocked. A single knock. The way he always knocked now. "Come in," she said. And she turned to face him, and the gold light came in with him, and the room, this small room she had grown up in, this room that had seen her cry and plan and promise and survive, filled with something it had been waiting a long time to hold. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. And if this story moved you, drop a comment below and share where in the world you watched from. Subscribe for more stories that prove silence can be the most powerful voice in the room.